The night pressed close against the walls of the maternity ward, muffling the outside world in silence. Snow fell over the city in delicate, restless spirals, clinging to the street lamps like a veil. Inside the hospital, the air was heavy with antiseptic, medicine, and that peculiar, indescribable scent that always seems to hover where new life begins. Nurses moved softly along the corridors, whispering in tired voices, their shoes tapping faintly against polished linoleum. The hour was late, but into separate rooms, two women were wide awake, carried forward by waves of pain and anticipation. One of them was Marina Sergeyevna, a tall, elegant woman whose face betrayed pride even in the midst of exhaustion. She was the wife of a wealthy businessman, accustomed to chandeliers, velvet cushions, servants, and soft carpets that silenced her every step. But here, beneath the sterile glare of hospital lamps, all of that had been stripped away. Her hair clung to her damp forehead, her fingers clutched at the thin sheet, and her eyes flashed with fear at the loss of control she had always demanded from life. In another room lay Anna Petrovna, slight, modest, her features plain, but softened by kindness. Her life was measured not in luxuries, but in sacrifices, a husband who drove long hours in a truck to provide for them, a small apartment where the wallpaper peeled from the damp, and a wallet that was always to light. Yet Anna carried within her warmth that money could not purchase. Even through pain, she whispered prayers under her breath, asking for nothing more than her child's safety. The hospital had dozed in half-silence until the stillness was broken by Marina's cry. Her voice rang sharp against the tiled walls, a raw sound torn from the depths of her body. Doctors rushed in, issuing quick commands, their hands moving with trained precision. Almost at the same time, Anna's contractions seized her. Her voice was softer, a strained murmur repeating a single plea. Let my baby live. Let him be healthy. Minutes stretched into eternity, the rhythm of breathing, shouting, and hurried footsteps weaving together like the relentless pounding of drums. And then the sound that cut through it all, the first cry of a newborn, Marina's child, a boy. His voice was strong, commanding, as if he already knew the world belonged to him. In the next room, moments later, another cry rose into the night, higher, thinner, but no less insistent. Anna's child, also a boy. Two lives entered the world almost in unison, two voices threading into the fabric of the snowy night. And somewhere, unseen, fate turned its wheel with careless fingers. The nursery filled with hurried movements. A young nurse, barely out of school, trembled as she prepared the identification bands. Exhaustion blurred her vision, her thoughts heavy from hours without rest. She scribbled the names quickly, clipped the bands onto the tiny wrists, and moved on. She never noticed that she had switched them. Wrapped in soft blue blankets, the two boys lay side by side, indistinguishable in their innocence. Their chests rose and fell with shallow breaths, their fists curled as if grasping at invisible threads. They did not know that the names on their arms belonged to strangers, that the paths of their futures had been altered in silence. When Marina was handed her baby, she managed a faint smile through her exhaustion. The boy's cheeks were full and pale, his face delicate, almost fragile. "My son," she whispered. "My heir." Anna wept when she cradled her child, pressing him close against her chest. His hair was dark and thick, his nose slightly upturned, his little mouth puckering as he searched for comfort. "My angel," she murmured. "Thank you, Lord, thank you." No one noticed. Not the nurse relieved to have survived a difficult night. Not the doctors already moving on to other patients. Not the mothers themselves who held their children with hearts too full to question anything. The mistake lay hidden beneath the quiet of dawn. Hours passed. Morning crept into the hospital with pale light that bled through frosted windows. Snow still drifted outside, wrapping the city in white. Inside, the ward returned to its routine. Nurses walked from bed to bed, mothers dozed, and babies wailed in concert like a strange, fragile choir. Life continued, unaware that history had bent itself in the dark. Days later, the mothers were discharged. Marina left first, her husband arriving in a polished car that gleamed against the grey slush. He carried himself with authority, his eyes already calculating the future of the son in his wife's arms. Marina, though still pale, lifted her chin high as if to remind herself that she belonged to a different world, one untouched by weakness. Anna's departure was quieter. Her husband came with a worn coat and nervous smile, clutching flowers that had cost him more than he could afford. He gazed at his wife and their child with a mix of awe and fear, as though the weight of fatherhood pressed on his shoulders, heavier than any cargo he had hauled in his truck. Two cars drove away from the same hospital that morning, each carrying a child whose name, whose blood, whose very life had been misplaced. One was carried into marble halls, where silence reigned and wealth overflowed but warmth was scarce. The other was taken to a small apartment, where love filled the cramped rooms though coins were few. The snow fell quietly, covering the roads, the rooftops, the city itself, as if erasing the footprints of truth. And so began the lives of two boys, their cries now softened into sleep, their destinies entwined by a mistake that no one had seen. A mistake that would remain hidden for years, waiting for the moment it would finally come to light. The years slipped by like pages torn from a book, fluttering into the past before anyone could hold them still. The two boys, born on the same snowy night, grew beneath different roofs, under skies that looked the same, but felt entirely different. Their cries had softened into laughter, their small fists into curious hands that reached for the world. They shared no memories of one another, no knowledge of their shared beginning, yet the invisible thread of their story stretched taut, waiting for the day it would be pulled. Marina's son was called Dmitri, though to his family and tutors he was always Dima. He lived in a grand apartment that overlooked the city, its windows rising high above the busy streets. Chandeliers glittered in the ceilings, carpets muffled every step, and the scent of polished wood and imported perfumes filled the air. Yet despite all the luxury, warmth was rare. His father, Sergei, was a man of business, stern and exacting, whose voice could silence a room with a single word. His mother, Marina, wore elegance like armor, moving through the apartment as if every gesture must be rehearsed. Dima had toys, rows of expensive wooden trains, cars with doors that opened, bears dressed in velvet suits, but they often sat untouched. What he longed for was someone to sit beside him, to laugh with him, to share in his small discoveries. Nannies came and went, their faces changing like seasons, and though some showed kindness, none could replace what he quietly needed, the presence of parents who would kneel on the floor and hold him. He grew into a quiet boy, his large eyes taking in everything, his lips slow to smile. He learned early to keep his feelings tucked away, like treasures hidden in a locked drawer. Across the city, in a small apartment on the outskirts, grew another boy, Alexei, though everyone called him Alyosha. His world was narrow, a single bedroom shared with his parents, a tiny kitchen that smelled of cabbage soup and fresh bread, a courtyard where children played among broken swings. But within those walls, love pulsed like a heartbeat. His father, Pavel, would lift him high after long days behind the wheel of his truck, his rough hands surprisingly gentle. His mother, Anna, though tired from endless chores, sang to him at night, her voice soft and trembling, filling the room with warmth. Alyosha had few toys, most of them worn or handmade, but to him they were treasures. A wooden horse carved by his father, a stuffed rabbit patched a dozen times, but still soft against his cheek. He had little, yet never felt poor, because his parents' love surrounded him like a constant blanket. His laughter was quick, his questions endless, his steps light with the joy of small discoveries. Years passed, and the differences grew sharper. Dima was taught French words before he was 5, attended music lessons he did not ask for, and wore clothes chosen to reflect the pride of his family name. He sat at long tables where conversations were clipped and polite, where silence was expected more than speech. Loneliness became a companion he did not name, one that crept into his dreams at night. Sometimes he would stand at the tall windows of the apartment, gazing down at children playing in the snow below, wishing he could run among them, hear his name shouted in laughter, feel the sting of snow on his cheeks. But the window remained a barrier, clear and unbreakable. Alyosha, by contrast, played in courtyards until his cheeks burned red from cold. He chased after friends, skinned his knees, laughed until his stomach ached. His parents scolded him, yes, but with eyes that shone with affection. Dinner was often plain, but every meal was shared together, voices mingling in warmth. He fell asleep to the murmur of his parents' voices, the creak of the old apartments settling into the night. Life was not easy, but it was rich with the things that mattered most to a child: presence, attention, love. Neither boy knew of the other, though sometimes life seemed to whisper hints. Dima, standing in front of a mirror, once asked his mother why his dark hair looked so unlike hers, why his nose curved differently from his father's. Marina dismissed the questions with a laugh too sharp, saying only that children often resemble distant relatives. Yet the doubt lingered in his eyes, though he never dared ask again. Alyosha, meanwhile, sometimes felt a flicker of strangeness when neighbors commented on his pale features. "He doesn't look much like you, Anna," they would say kindly, glancing between mother and son. Anna always smiled, brushing the comments aside, but later, alone, she would stare at him as he slept, a whisper of unease curling in her chest before she pushed it away. The city carried on. Seasons turned, summers blazed, winters froze. Two boys, born of one night's mistake, lived parallel lives that seemed worlds apart. One among marble floors and chandeliers, the other in a cramped apartment with peeling wallpaper. Yet both carried inside them a quiet longing, a sense that something unseen pressed against the edges of their lives. And though no one knew it yet, the time would come when those longings would converge, when truth would claw its way out from the shadows. For now, the secret slept, buried beneath years of silence, waiting for the moment when it would awaken and change everything. By the time the boys were old enough for school, their paths had already diverged into two entirely different landscapes. For Dmitri, the world was shaped by tutors, polished shoes, and the expectation of excellence. For Alexei, it was playgrounds with rusting swings, chalk drawings on cracked sidewalks, and the freedom to learn through scraped knees and laughter. Dmitri's mornings began with discipline. He woke in a spacious bedroom where heavy curtains blocked out the sun, the silence broken only by the ticking of an expensive clock. His mother entered with a brisk word, his nanny followed with clothes pressed to perfection, and soon after came the lessons. French vocabulary, piano scales, mathematics drilled until the numbers blurred. He rarely questioned why, for he quickly learned that hesitation brought only sharp glances from his father and the clipped tone of disappointment. His smiles were rare, his laughter softer than the creak of the grand apartment's floors. At school, he stood apart. His uniform was always immaculate, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, yet the other children kept their distance. He was polite, reserved, but a wall seemed to surround him, invisible yet impenetrable. They sensed the difference, not only in wealth, but in the quiet sadness that lingered in his eyes. Sometimes he watched them from afar, longing to join their noisy games, but pride and shyness locked him in place. He learned early to find solace in books, in silent companions that never turned away. For Alexei, mornings were chaos, the smell of fried potatoes, the clatter of dishes, his father rushing to pull on his boots before heading to the truck yard. His mother's voice called from the kitchen, urging him to eat quickly, to grab his worn school bag before the bell. The apartment was small, the walls thin, but laughter filled every corner. He often darted out the door with a piece of bread in hand, his scarf half tied, his cheeks glowing from the cold. At school, Alyosha, as everyone called him, was a whirlwind. He had a smile that lit up his whole face, quick hands eager to share his lunch with a friend who had none, a voice that rang through the corridors. He wasn't the top student, though he tried, but his heart drew people to him. Teachers scolded him for talking too much, for whispering jokes during lessons, yet they could not help but soften at his charm. To his classmates, he was the boy who made even the dullest day brighter. And so the years spun forward. Dmitri learned to hold his emotions in check, to walk with the straight back and measured tone his father demanded. At times he stared at his reflection, noticing how his features didn't quite match those of his parents. His father's eyes were pale, his mother's hair was light, yet his own hair was dark as midnight, his skin warmer in tone. Questions formed on his lips, but fear of their answers kept him silent. Alexei, meanwhile, thrived in the glow of affection. He grew taller, stronger, his laughter deepening with age. Yet sometimes, late at night, he caught his mother staring at him with an odd expression, a blend of love and something unspoken, a question she never voiced. He would smile, ask what was wrong, and she would only shake her head, pulling him into an embrace, as if holding him tightly might keep the doubts away. The city was vast, yet their worlds nearly touched at times. Dmitri's family passed through the streets in sleek cars with tinted windows, while Alexei chased a ball in the same neighborhoods, his breath steaming in the winter air. Perhaps they saw each other once or twice, a fleeting glance from a window, a shadow on the sidewalk, but neither knew. The thread of fate remained taut, invisible, drawing them closer with each passing year. By the time they reached their early teens, both boys felt the weight of something undefined pressing against them. Dmitry carried loneliness like a hidden scar, while Alexei carried questions he did not yet understand. Their lives had been built on an error, a simple slip of a nurse's hand, but its echo grew louder with time. The truth still slept, but it stirred faintly now, restless in its silence. One day soon, it would awaken. And when it did, neither boy, nor the families who loved them, would ever be the same again. Adolescence crept in slowly, like a shadow stretching longer with each season. The boys, once children with innocent laughter, now faced the turbulence of their teenage years. Their worlds, though still separate, began to feel heavier with questions, responsibilities, and silent struggles. Dmitry entered his 14th year with the same quiet reserve that had marked his childhood. His father's demands grew sharper, his expectations taller than the boy himself. School had shifted from gentle lessons to fierce competition, and every grade was measured against the weight of his father's ambition. Piano lessons were no longer a pastime but an obligation, his hands pressed to keys he did not love, his ears filled with notes that brought no joy. At gatherings, he stood behind his parents, dressed impeccably, smiling faintly when required. Inside, however, a storm brewed. Loneliness had become more than a companion, it was a prison. He longed for freedom, for laughter unrestrained, for someone to see him not as a project or an heir, but simply as a boy. He spent long hours gazing from his high window, watching life bustle below. The children who once played in the snow were now teenagers themselves, running in groups, shouting, their voices echoing into the evening. Dmitry envied them, their easy joy, their careless friendships. But he remained behind glass, as though separated from the world by an invisible wall. Sometimes he pressed his hand against the cold pane, imagining what it might be like to step outside not as the son of Sergei, but as himself. Across the city, Alexei's teenage years unfolded with equal intensity, though painted in brighter colors. He was the life of his school, tall now, with an energy that seemed boundless. His laugh was quick, his charm effortless, and though his grades wavered, his heart won him the affection of classmates and teachers alike. Yet beneath the cheer, questions gnawed at him. More than once, he had overheard whispers, neighbors noting how little he resembled his parents, classmates asking why his features seemed different. At first he brushed it aside with jokes, but as he grew older, the words lodged deeper. One winter evening, while helping his mother with dinner, he asked suddenly, "Mama, do I really look like Papa?" Anna froze, the knife halting over the cutting board. For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the hiss of the pan. Then she forced a smile, touched his cheek, and said softly, "Of course you do. You have his strength, his kindness." But Alexei saw the flicker in her eyes, the hesitation. It planted a seed of doubt that refused to fade. At school, Alexei excelled not in academics, but in friendship. He played soccer until his legs ached, ran through the streets with friends until dusk, and shared dreams under the stars. Yet even in the warmth of companionship, he felt the occasional chill of being different. It was as though some piece of himself was missing, some truth that lingered just beyond reach. The city continued its indifferent rhythm. Dmitry and Alexei sometimes passed through the same streets, their lives brushing against one another without recognition. Dmitry might sit in the back seat of his father's car, staring out at a group of boys laughing near a corner store. Alexei might be among them, tossing a ball, shouting with joy. Their eyes might have met once or twice, a fleeting second, quickly forgotten, yet something unspoken stirred each time, like an echo of familiarity neither could name. At night, both boys lay awake in their separate homes, hearts restless. Dmitry dreamed of freedom, of a life where love was not measured by achievement. Alexei dreamed of answers, of understanding who he truly was. Both were searching, though neither knew it yet, for the truth that bound them together. And in the silence of that search, the secret of their birth stirred once more, restless in its hiding place. It would not sleep forever. Soon, circumstance would bring the first cracks to the walls of deception. Soon, the boys would begin to step closer to the revelation that would shatter their worlds and rebuild them anew. The summer of their 15th year arrived with long days and restless nights. The city pulsed with heat, the asphalt shimmering, the parks filled with children chasing each other beneath trees heavy with green. For both Dmitry and Alexei, it was a season of change, though neither yet understood how close they were to the truth that had slept for so many years. Dmitry found little relief in summer. His father enrolled him in an exclusive camp outside the city, a place where the sons of businessmen and politicians were sent to learn discipline and polish their manners. The grounds stretched wide, with manicured lawns and tidy dormitories, but to Dmitri it felt like another prison with walls invisible yet suffocating. Each day was filled with schedules, morning runs, foreign language practice, debates staged before stern instructors. He obeyed, as always, but a quiet rebellion simmered beneath his calm exterior. He began to slip away in the evenings, wandering the edges of the camp, listening to the laughter of boys who played soccer or told stories by firelight. Sometimes he longed to join them, but the weight of his name held him back, the fear that someone might discover his loneliness and laugh. Alexei's summer was different. He worked part-time with his father, helping unload crates at the truck yard, his hands blistered but his spirit high. The money he earned was small, yet he carried it with pride, handing part of it to his mother for groceries, saving the rest for a pair of shoes he had been eyeing for months. When he wasn't working, he was out with friends swimming in the river, climbing fences, running through the streets until the stars burned overhead. His laughter rang out in the warm nights, careless and free, yet the questions about his origins still lingered in the back of his mind. It was during that summer that the first true crack appeared in the wall of secrecy. Alexei fell during a soccer match, cutting his leg badly on a rusted nail. At the hospital, the doctor ordered a routine blood test. Days later, Anna received the results and was told there had been a mix-up, that the blood type listed in Alexei's birth records did not match his own. The nurse dismissed it as a clerical error, but Anna's heart clenched. She remembered the night of his birth, the exhaustion, the hurried movements of the staff. She tried to bury the memory, to silence the questions that had haunted her for years, but now they screamed louder than ever. Meanwhile, Dmitri also faced a moment that unsettled him. One afternoon at the camp, he overheard two instructors whispering. They spoke of his father's influence, of how much pressure was placed upon the boy, and one of them remarked softly, "It's strange, he doesn't even look like his father." Dmitri froze, the words striking him like a blow. He returned to his dorm that night, staring at his reflection in the small mirror by his bed. His dark hair, his strong features so unlike the pale faces of his parents. The seed of doubt, planted long ago, pushed deeper roots. Both boys carried their questions silently. Dmitri returned home from camp quieter than ever, avoiding his father's stern gaze. Alexei kept his suspicions hidden, though sometimes he studied his parents with a searching look, as if trying to read a secret etched into their faces. Anna noticed, and her heart trembled with fear, but still she said nothing. The summer waned, the first hints of autumn cooling the nights. Yet something had shifted. The truth, long buried beneath snow and silence, had begun to stir more violently. Neither Dmitri nor Alexei could name it yet, but both felt its presence, like a storm gathering at the horizon. And though the city remained vast, their paths began to curve closer. Fate, patient and persistent, was drawing them together, step by step, toward the moment that would change everything. Autumn settled over the city like a faded cloak, painting the trees in rust and gold, filling the air with the scent of wet leaves. School began again, pulling both boys into the rhythm of studies and responsibility, though each carried with him the restless unease born during the summer. The questions that had begun to whisper would not quiet, and in the stillness of long nights, they grew louder. For Dmitri, school was less about learning than about maintaining an image. He was enrolled in one of the city's most prestigious academies, where uniforms were pressed and expectations higher than the stone walls surrounding the campus. Teachers praised his diligence, but their approval did little to warm him. His classmates respected him, but rarely invited him into their circles. He was too distant, too burdened by the unspoken weight of his family's reputation. In the cafeteria, he often ate alone, listening to the laughter of others from the edge of the room. The loneliness that had shadowed his childhood seemed to grow taller with him, following him into every hallway. Yet it was in that same cafeteria one afternoon that fate began to weave its threads tighter. Dmitri dropped his notebook on his way to a table, and before he could bend to pick it up, another boy stooped quickly and handed it back. That boy was Alexei. His school, less prestigious and far from polished, had sent a group of students to Dmitri's academy for a joint competition. Their eyes met, one pair dark and solemn, the other bright and curious. For a moment, they simply stared, struck by an odd sense of familiarity neither could explain. Then Alexei grinned, his usual easy smile, and said, "You should keep a better grip on your things." Dmitry muttered a quiet thank you, but the moment lingered with both of them. Alexei returned to his own school after the competition, but something about the encounter stayed in his thoughts. Dmitry's face haunted him. There was something in his features that felt strangely known, though Alexei was sure they had never met before. Dmitry, too, found himself replaying the moment, the spark of connection unlike anything he had felt with his peers. He told no one. Of course, speaking such thoughts aloud in his household was unthinkable. Meanwhile, Anna wrestled silently with the results of the summer's blood test. She had locked the paper away in a drawer, but its presence gnawed at her. Each time she looked at Alexei, love swelled in her heart, yet so did fear. She recalled the confusion in the maternity ward, the rushed hands of the nurses, the haze of exhaustion. Could it be possible? Could he not be hers by blood? She wanted to dismiss the thought, to bury it as she always had, but the seed had sprouted, and doubt grew with every passing day. Marina, on the other hand, noticed her son's increasing distance. Dmitry spoke less, his gaze often fixed on some faraway horizon. She scolded him for his lack of enthusiasm, chided him for failing to meet her husband's stern standards. But in rare, unguarded moments, she felt a pang of something unfamiliar guilt. When she looked into his eyes, so unlike her own, she felt a flicker of unease, quickly hidden beneath her pride. The season deepened, the days shortening, the nights lengthening. Dmitry and Alexei returned to their routines, yet both carried with them the strange weight of that brief meeting. It was as if a mirror had been held up to their lives for the first time, reflecting questions they had never dared to speak. One evening, Dmitry sat at his desk, staring at a photograph of himself between his parents. The differences were stark: his hair, his eyes, his features all stood apart. He whispered to himself, almost afraid of the sound, "Do I even belong here?" Across the city, Alexei lay awake, listening to the hum of the old radiator in his room. He thought of the boy with solemn eyes, the one who looked so strangely like him. "Who are you?" he murmured into the dark, though no answer came. The city's heartbeat went on, trains rushing, lights flickering, people hurrying through the chill of autumn evenings. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm, something extraordinary was moving. Two boys, bound by a mistake of fate, had crossed paths at last. Their journeys, once parallel, were curving toward each other with growing inevitability. The secret, restless for so long, was drawing closer to the surface. Winter descended early that year, blanketing the city in heavy snow that muffled the noise of traffic and softened the edges of grey buildings. Streets glowed faintly under the yellow lamps, while children's laughter rang out as they built crooked snowmen in the courtyards. Beneath the quiet beauty, both Dmitry and Alexei carried restlessness within them, a weight that the cold air could not freeze. Dmitry's household became harsher in the long nights. His father demanded more of him, insisting that his studies must set him apart, that every score, every recital, every competition was a step toward the family's legacy. Dmitry obeyed outwardly, but inside the pressure hollowed him. He felt himself shrinking into silence, watching his own reflection grow into someone he barely recognized. At night he sat by the window, staring at the falling snow, wondering if there was a world where he could breathe without fear of failing. Alexei, meanwhile, thrived among friends in the snow-covered courtyards. His cheeks burned red from the cold, his laughter echoing as he chased after soccer balls that skidded across icy patches. Yet the questions that had haunted him all autumn remained. More than once, he had stood before the cracked mirror in his family's small bathroom, studying his face. His mother's eyes were soft and light, his father's nose broad and strong, but his own features felt like a stranger's, dark, sharp, foreign. Each time he asked himself if love alone was enough to make a family. It was during this winter that fate pressed the boys closer again. Both schools were chosen to participate in a citywide art exhibition, their works displayed side by side in a tall, echoing hall filled with parents, teachers, and curious visitors. Dmitry submitted a sketch, precise but restrained, lines drawn with discipline rather than joy. Alexei painted a canvas full of color, messy but alive, splashes of brightness against the pale backdrop of snow outside. On the evening of the exhibition, they saw each other again. Dmitry stood near his sketch, hands folded, shoulders tense under the weight of expectation. Alexei moved through the crowd with ease, laughing with classmates, his energy drawing people in. Their eyes met across the room, And again that unexplainable recognition stirred. Dmitri looked away quickly, but Alexei, bold as ever, crossed the floor and stopped beside him. "Your drawing's good," he said simply, glancing at the neat lines of Dmitri's work. "But it feels lonely." Dmitri stiffened, surprised by the honesty. "It's just a sketch," he replied quietly. Alexei grinned, tilting his head. "Maybe. Or maybe it says more than you think." Then, without waiting for an answer, he was gone, swept back into the crowd of friends. The words stayed with Dmitri long after the exhibition ended. No one had ever spoken to him like that, as if his inner world had been seen through paper and pencil. For the first time, he felt exposed yet strangely understood. Alexei, too, carried the encounter with him. There was something about the boy's solemn eyes that tugged at him, a feeling he could not shake. As snow piled higher against the windows of their separate homes, both boys began to dream differently. Dmitri dreamed of running through courtyards without fear, his laughter free. Alexei dreamed of mirrors that reflected faces he could not name. Neither knew that their dreams were weaving the same story, that the secret of their birth was stirring more fiercely now, breaking through the silence of years. Winter would not last forever. And when the snow melted, so too would the fragile walls that had kept the truth hidden. Spring crept slowly into the city, melting the thick crust of snow and filling the streets with the smell of wet earth. Children splashed in puddles, the air buzzed with the chatter of sparrows, and sunlight spilled into courtyards that had slept under frost for months. Yet for Dmitri and Alexei, the thaw brought not only warmth, but the beginning of something far more unsettling. The first real cracks in the walls that had concealed their true identities. For Alexei, the questions became unavoidable. One evening after school, he sat with his parents at the dinner table, the usual meal of potatoes and cabbage steaming between them. He looked from his father's rough hands to his mother's soft face, then down at his own skin, darker than theirs, at the hair that curled against his forehead. Finally, he asked the question that had lived in him for years. "Mama, Papa, why don't I look like you?" Silence fell. Anna's spoon slipped against her bowl, her eyes darting to Pavel, whose jaw tightened. For a moment it seemed they might dismiss it as always, with laughter or a simple explanation. But Alexei's voice trembled now, urgent. "I mean it. People say it all the time. I don't look like either of you. Tell me the truth." Pavel cleared his throat, his voice rough. "You're our son, Alyosha. That's all that matters." Anna reached for his hand, but her own trembled. Tears shimmered in her eyes though she fought them back. Alexei looked between them, and though no confession came, the silence said more than words. He stood abruptly, muttering an excuse, and left the table. That night he lay awake staring at the ceiling, the sound of his mother's muffled sobs carrying through the thin apartment walls. The seed of doubt had grown into something undeniable. Meanwhile, across the city, Dmitri faced his own storm. His father had arranged for him to attend a family gathering, where relatives filled the grand apartment with polished laughter and cold smiles. Photographs lined the walls, portraits of ancestors, pale-skinned and fair-haired, generations of faces that bore no resemblance to his own. Dmitri stood before them, his reflection caught in the glass frames, and the differences burned in him like a flame. Later that night, he confronted his mother quietly when the guests had gone. "Why don't I look like anyone in this family?" His voice was steady, but his eyes searched hers with desperate intensity. Marina froze, her elegant posture faltering. For a heartbeat, guilt flickered in her eyes, quickly masked by irritation. "Nonsense," she snapped, too sharply. "Children take after distant relatives. You think too much." But Dmitri saw it, the way her hands twisted together, the way her gaze avoided his. He said nothing more, but in his chest, the questions roared louder than ever. And then fate moved again, weaving the threads closer. A school science project brought students from different districts together. By chance or perhaps by destiny, both Dmitri and Alexei were selected. They found themselves sitting in the same classroom, side by side, forced to work as partners on a biology assignment that required blood typing. The exercise was simple: prick a finger, test for antigens, record the result. But when Dmitri and Alexei compared their findings, confusion struck. "Your typo?" Alexei asked, staring at Dmitri's paper. "Yes." "Why?" "I'm typo too." Alexei frowned. "But my parents are type of and B. The nurse at the clinic told me it was impossible, that maybe there was a mistake." Dmitri hesitated, the memory of his own doubts pressing heavily on him. "My parents are both A," he said quietly, "and still MO." They looked at each other, the silence between them charged with something new. Their features, so different and yet oddly familiar, seemed to mirror questions they had never dared to voice aloud. For the first time, suspicion shifted into possibility. That evening, Alexei walked home with the wind sharp against his face, his thoughts racing. Dmitri returned to his silent apartment, the ticking of the clock unbearably loud. Both boys carried the same realization now. Something was wrong, something that reached back to the very night of their birth. And though neither yet knew the truth, they felt it pressing closer, a storm gathering at the edge of their lives. Soon, the secret would no longer stay buried. Soon, the past would demand to be heard. The city swelled with the warmth of late spring, the streets alive with blossoms and the hum of busy markets. But inside to homes, the air was heavier than the season suggested, thick with secrets straining against silence. Anna could no longer keep her fear buried. The memory of the hospital visit the previous summer, the blood test, and Alexei's pointed questions gnawed at her constantly. One evening, after her son had gone to bed, she sat at the small kitchen table, her hands twisting a worn napkin, her eyes red from holding back tears. "Pavel," she whispered, "what if Hay's not ours?" Her husband, exhausted from another long day behind the wheel, froze with his teacup in hand. He wanted to dismiss it as nonsense, to insist that love made a family stronger than blood. But he saw the torment in his wife's eyes and felt it in his own chest. He set the cup down slowly, staring into the steam. "I've thought it too," he admitted. His voice was hoarse. "Ever since the neighbors made those remarks, Hay's ours in every way that matters." But if something happened that night in the hospital, Anna's tears spilled over at last. She covered her face with her hands, shaking her head. "I couldn't bear to lose him, Pavel. Hay's my son, no matter what." Across the city, another conversation was unfolding in colder tones. Dmitri had grown increasingly quiet, retreating deeper into himself. His father noticed only when Dmitri's grades slipped slightly in mathematics. Furious, Sergei confronted him, demanding explanations, berating him for weakness. That night, Marina entered Dmitri's room to find him sitting on the floor, photographs scattered around him. He looked up at her, his eyes dark and searching. "Tell me the truth," he said quietly. "Why don't I look like either of you?" Marina's carefully rehearsed composure faltered. She tried to offer the usual excuses, but the words felt brittle. Dmitri pressed further, his voice trembling. "Was I adopted? Am I even your son?" The question cut her like a blade. For years she had buried the doubt, silenced it beneath denial and pride. But now, staring at her son, this boy who looked so little like her, who carried in his eyes a loneliness she could never soothe, she felt the truth clawing its way to the surface. "No," she whispered too quickly, too sharply. But her hands trembled, and Dmitri saw it. He turned away from her, his chest tight, knowing the denial was a lie. The next week brought the inevitable turn. Alexei, unable to live with the gnawing questions, decided to search for answers himself. In the dusty archives of the local clinic, he persuaded a sympathetic nurse to show him his birth records. He traced the lines of ink with his finger, his heart pounding. And there it was, a date, a time, a note that seemed smudged, irregular. The document listed his mother's name, but something about the handwriting was strange, as if altered. He took a copy home, showing it to Anna. She grew pale, her hand covering her mouth. "This isn't how it was written before," she whispered. "I remember the nurse, she was new. She was clumsy." Alexei stared at her, his voice hoarse. "So it's true. I might not be your son." Anna grabbed his face, her tears falling hot onto his skin. "You are my son. You'll always be my son. Blood doesn't matter to me. But maybe there's something we need to know." Meanwhile, Dmitri acted on his own suspicions. One afternoon, while his parents were out, he searched through drawers in the study. He found a sealed envelope, tucked beneath old papers, with his name written on it in a doctor's careful hand. His fingers trembled as he tore it open. Inside was a medical certificate from the hospital on the night of his birth, but the name of the attending nurse was different from the one his parents had told him, and the time of birth didn't match what he had always been told. His breath quickened, the room spinning. Both boys now held fragments of the truth, though not yet the whole. It was only a matter of time before those fragments collided. And when they did, the carefully built walls of Tefamla's would come crashing down. leaving only the raw, undeniable truth. Two boys born of the same night, switched by accident. Raised in lives that were never theirs to begin with, the tension that had simmered beneath the surface finally demanded release. For weeks, Dmitry carried the secret envelope with him, hidden at the bottom of his school bag, pulling it out at night to stare at the mismatched dates and signatures. Alexei, too, kept the copy of his altered birth record folded into the pages of a notebook, the paper worn thin at the creases from constant handling. Both boys lived in restless silence, their questions swelling louder than any answers they could find. It was Alexei who made the first decisive move. Driven by a mixture of fear and determination, he returned to the hospital where he had been born. The building smelled the same, sterile, with an undertone of something metallic that clung to the air. Time seemed to press down on him as he walked the corridors, his shoes squeaking faintly against the linoleum. He sought out the oldest nurse he could find, someone who might have been there all those years ago. She listened quietly as he asked about the night of his birth, her expression guarded. When he showed her the record, her lips tightened. For a long time she said nothing, then sighed heavily, lowering her gaze. "There were two boys born that night," she murmured. It was a difficult shift. The ward was understaffed, and a new girl was responsible for the tags. I remember confusion. I told myself later it was nothing, but her voice trailed off, and she shook her head as if to banish the memory. I cannot say more. Too much time has passed. But Alexei needed no further confirmation. The truth had cracked open, and once seen, it could not be unseen. He left the hospital with his chest burning, his world spinning. At nearly the same time, Dmitry took his envelope to a quiet corner of the city library, where the silence allowed his thoughts to roar unchecked. He compared the certificate with other records, checking dates, cross-referencing times. Everything pointed to one conclusion: something had been hidden, something his parents had never wanted him to know. Fate chose that very week to bring them together again. Their schools were both selected to participate in a city debate competition. The event drew students from every district, and when Dmitry walked into the hall, his eyes immediately caught Alexei's across the crowd. That same strange familiarity surged between them, stronger now, sharper. They ended up seated next to each other, their names called as partners for one of the rounds. As the debate began, they performed with surprising harmony, Dmitry precise and analytical, Alexei bold and passionate. The judges nodded in approval, but neither boy cared for the outcome. Between them lay the weight of unspoken truths. When the round ended and the room emptied, Alexei turned to him suddenly. "Dmitry, what's your blood type?" Dmitry blinked, startled. "Oh, why?" Alexei's throat tightened. He pulled the folded record from his notebook and thrust it forward. "Because mine's O2. And my parents," his voice broke. "They can't be my parents. Not by blood." Dmitry stared at the paper, then slowly reached into his bag. With trembling hands, he pulled out the envelope and showed Alexei the certificate. The boy's eyes met, both wide with fear and recognition. In that instant, everything shifted. The silence stretched between them until Alexei whispered, "Do you think we were switched?" Dmitry's heart pounded so hard he could barely breathe. It's the only thing that makes sense. The truth, once only a shadow, now loomed before them in full. To lives, to families, a single mistake. Neither boy knew what to do with the revelation, but both knew they could not carry it alone. And so, hesitantly, they agreed to meet again, outside of school, away from prying eyes. There, they would decide what came next. Meanwhile, at home, the unease in both families grew unbearable. Anna caught Alexei staring at her with searching eyes, and Marina found Dmitry slipping into silence deeper than ever before. The mothers sensed the storm coming, though neither dared name it. The time of secrets was ending. The time of confrontation was near.